It means that we were intended to relate to our fellow human beings like God relates. In Christian theology, we believe that all human beings are made in God's image. That means that every single human person is made to be like God. And that is why the doctrine of the Trinity, the historic Orthodox doctrine of the church, is so important. Because it doesn't only tell us something about who God is, it tells us something about who we are as human beings. See, we don't think of God as just one person sitting on a throne in heaven, wielding the bolts of a Jupiter on the top of the hierarchy of all things. No, we believe that God is relational. Eternally relational, actually. Because we believe that God is not one person, but three persons. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And that these three persons are always, constantly living and operating in a relationship of love between one another. Now, this idea took centuries to really kind of come together and make sense, but in the 4th century, a man by the name of Tertullian, a theologian, really succinctly described God as one God in three persons. This is the phrase that we use in Christian theology to just quickly define who God is. One God in three persons. But if we break this down into the original Greek language, it says that God is one ousia in three hypostases. Now, don't worry, we'll talk about this. Okay, first ousia. Ousia means nature or substance. Essence, stuff. And hypostases means persons. So Tertullian was saying that our God is one nature in three persons. So let's talk first about nature. Let's talk about ousia. Nature or substance is what something is made up of. It's the stuff that something is composed of. It's basically the stuff that makes something what it is. And we do not know exactly what the stuff is that makes God God, because we can't take a piece of God and put it under a microscope and study it and dissect it and figure out what divine nature is. But we do know that whatever it is that makes God God, the Father has that stuff, the Son has that, and the Holy Spirit has that. All three persons of the Trinity have divine nature. They are all equally God. It's kind of like us, human beings, how we all have human nature, right? Everything that makes us human, a mind, a body, emotion, a will towards action, we all have that. We all have that same human nature. And we don't completely know what that stuff that makes us human is either. I mean, we know some stuff, but we don't know completely what human nature is. But again, we do know that whatever it is that makes you human, you all have it, and I have it. Every human person has human nature, human substance. So, ousia, nature then, is basically what someone has. It's what makes something what it is. But hypostases, the Greek word for person, is different. A person is a center of self-consciousness. It's not really what you have, it's more who you are. It's what sets you apart from everyone else. I mean, we all equally have human nature, but no one is who you are. no one is the same person that you are, because we are all distinct centers of self-consciousness. We all have our own mind. We all have our own emotions and desires. We all have our own will that we can use to make decisions and choices towards certain things and away from other things. We are all different persons. And what makes us distinct is the relationships that we have with other persons. So even people who are very similar, people who have very similar background, very similar culture, speak the same language, even those type of people are still distinct persons because they each have different relationships with other beings. And they make different decisions and choices within those relationships that make them distinguishable from other persons. So, take for example some siblings, okay? This is true for me and my sisters. All three of us grew up in the same home. We were all sisters born of the same parents. We have the same culture, the same ethnic background. We speak the same language, same religion, so many similarities. And yet, we are distinct from one another because our personhood is different. And we relate to even the members of our family in different ways. So I have a different relationship with my parents than my sisters do, simply because they're different persons and they make different decisions and choices within that web of relationships. So while we are all equally human, because of our same human nature, the same stuff that makes us human, we are all distinct persons because of the decisions and choices we make in relationship with others. This is how God is. God, like Tertullian said, is one nature in three persons. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all equally God because they all share divine nature. They all have divine substance. But they are all distinct persons from each other because each person relates to the others differently and distinctly. However, make a quick note here, because it sounds like, what's the difference between us and God? Distinct persons, same nature, okay? But there's a big difference between divine nature and human nature. And one of the differences is something that theologians like to call perichoresis. Perichoresis. And that just means that God's nature is not circumscribed. And therefore, the persons in the Trinity can intermingle one another. So our human nature is circumscribed, right? To be a human is to have a body, to be tangible, to be physical, right? We are bound to a certain time and space. And we cannot be in another time and space unless we go there. But God's nature is different. God's nature intermingles. The persons of God are constantly joined and unified, without separation, without division. So, for example, if you have the Father, you have the Son and the Holy Spirit too. You cannot have the Son without the Father and the Holy Spirit too. And that means you can't have the Father over there and the Son back here and the Holy Spirit up here. Wherever you have God the Father, you have God the Son and God the Holy Spirit too. Because of this perichoresis, this extreme unity that divine nature is always participating in. That's kind of where we are very different from God, because our nature, like we said, is tangible, physical, bound to time and space. So immediately, we are separated from one another. But through relationship, through entering into relationships with other persons, we can become more and more like God, more and more like the Trinity, full of unity and equality and distinguishability. Now, are you beginning to see here the intense need for this doctrine? Is it starting to make more sense why it's so important to recognize that we, human beings everywhere, were made in God's image? Because we were made to operate as God does. We were meant to live in relationships like God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit does. And this is why analogies of an egg or an apple just seem to fall down. They don't work very well. They're analogies of one inanimate object that's not personal, that doesn't have a will. There's no ability for it to relate willingly with itself or others. But an analogy of a family, that one works. An analogy of a family or a community of people resembles the Trinity to a much higher degree. Take, for example, a family with a mother, a father, and a child. In a family, we have three distinct persons, three centers of self-consciousness. But each of them are bound by the same nature. They all three share human nature. None of them are more human than the other one. None of them are less human than the others. They are all bound by the same equal human nature, and yet clearly distinct. You can tell them apart. The mother is not the father. The father is not the child. The child is not the mother. This is how God is. Sharing one divine nature, one divine substance, and yet distinct in their personhood. The Father is not the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is not the Son. The Son is not the Father. And yet they all share that divine nature. They are still always operating in these relationships of love and goodness, giving to each other selflessly and receiving openly from one another. And this is how the Trinity is reflected in the family. This is how we as persons can be like God. When we recognize that our nature is bound and unified in the fact that we all share our human nature. And in recognizing the distinct nature of our own personhood. That we are actually distinguishable through the relationships that we have within our families and our friends and all the communities of people we interact with. Thanks for helping me out. Even if people seem extremely different, even when people seem like they have a completely different background, different culture, different ethnicity, different genders, different ages, that diversity can find unity when we operate like God operates. And this is what we mean when we say that we were created in God's own image. It means that we were intended to relate to our fellow human beings like God relates. In mutual love and trust, just like the persons of the Trinity do. Always sharing our lives with one another openly and selflessly giving of ourselves and receiving from others. The whole community of the entire human race is and must become more Trinitarian. And though we cannot become exactly like God because of perichoresis, because of that intermingling nature that God alone has, we can still choose to be unified in deeper and deeper levels and degrees. We can choose to align our wills with one another. We can choose to step into relationships with people that express mutual love and mutual trust, giving of ourselves and openly receiving. This is how we exemplify the Trinity. And we must learn to also recognize and celebrate our equality as human beings as well. Just as God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are equal, completely God, one is not more divine than the other, so are we human beings, equally human because of the nature that we share. And we must celebrate that and live into the goodness of that reality, seeing that we are bound by our human nature. We are also somewhat bound by time and space together here in this world, in this town, in this year. We are together, bound to one another. And yet we also must choose to recognize our distinct personhoods. We must celebrate that we each are a diverse person, able to operate in relationship in different ways, bringing different things to the table, and participating in life together. We must choose to move out of systems that breed separate groups of giving and receiving. We must choose to take notice of each of our own areas of deficit and need, and each of our own areas of privilege and power, and choose to say, we can join with one another and still be the distinct persons we are while operating in relationship together. And this is not because it's politically correct or because we're trying to be progressive or because it's the right thing to do, but because we were all given this honor, this profound and mysterious grace to be made in God's own image. We, human beings, have this mystical ability to actually live like the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And it begins outside of ourselves. It begins not when we are alone in our prayer closet or segregated in our own worship services or our own neighborhoods. But it begins when I step outside of my own self and look to those around me. And when I willingly choose to live in relationship with those around me, openly giving of myself and willingly receiving from others. So that the community no longer can tell who is the giver and who is the receiver, but that it is just like the community of God. Complete equality, complete unity, and complete distinguishability. And when we willingly choose to live in relationship in these ways, we will become like God to more and more degrees every day. But we must choose to operate in our relationships, aligning our wills with one another through faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love.